My name is Dr. Aris Thorne, and for 3 decades, the Hadal Zone has been my world. More specifically, the Mariana Trench, the deepest, most brutal scar on the planet's face, has been my office, my laboratory, and, on more than one occasion, nearly my tomb. I have piloted submersibles to depths where the pressure can crush steel like a soda can, and the darkness is so absolute it feels like a physical weight. I have spent more time alone in a tiny steel capsule miles beneath the surface than most people spend in their cars in a year. I am intimately familiar with profound isolation, the sensory deprivation that can trick an untrained mind into seeing phantoms in the marine snow. In that time, I have witnessed things that defy belief. Ghost, like snailfish that thrive where other life is crushed to pulp, hydrothermal vents that spew liquid carbon dioxide, and entire ecosystems built on the chemical soup leaking from the Earth's crust. I thought I had seen it all. I was wrong. Our final mission was the culmination of years of preparatory work, a mission to investigate a geological feature so strange, so out of place. It had earned a name more suited to myth than science. High-resolution sonar mapping, conducted by an autonomous underwater vehicle, a UV we deployed the previous year, had revealed what our geologists had grimly nicknamed the Serena Anomaly. Located in an unmapped basin just east of the Challenger Deep, near the known Serena Deep, was a formation that defied all explanation. The AUV's data painted a picture of a vast, circular plain on the seafloor, nearly 10 kilometers in diameter. Its surface was unnaturally smooth, with a sonar reflectivity profile akin to polished obsidian. This plain was ringed by what appeared to be fields of ancient, cold pillow lavas, the toothpaste, like extrusions of submarine eruptions, but they were impossibly old and showed no signs of recent hydrothermal activity. The most unsettling part was the acoustic data. The AUV's hydrophones had registered a faint, persistent, ultra-low frequency hum emanating from the center of the plane. It was structured, rhythmic, and utterly alien. To investigate this, we brought the Charon IV, the most advanced deep-sea submersible ever constructed. She was my vessel, a 24-foot vertical submersible designed for a single purpose: to reach the deepest points on the planet, conduct meaningful science, and return her pilot safely. Her design was a marvel of engineering, built upon the lessons learned from legendary vehicles like James Cameron's Deep-Sea Challenger. Her unique vertical orientation allowed for a swift 2.5-hour descent, maximizing bottom time. The main structural beam was a masterpiece of material science, a proprietary syntactic foam composed of microscopic glass spheres embedded in an epoxy resin, the only flotation material capable of withstanding the 16,000 psi pressures of the Hadal Zone while providing structural support. Slung beneath this beam was my world, the pilot sphere. It was a cocoon of forged steel, 64 millimeters thick, with an internal diameter of just over a meter. It was cramped, Spartan, and the safest place on Earth. Inside, I was surrounded by the quiet hum of technology, the life support system scrubbing carbon dioxide and bleeding in a steady supply of oxygen. The pressure, equalized lithium-ion battery banks powering our systems, and the control panel that monitored the submersible's 180 interconnected systems. Victim Charon IV was not just a vehicle, she was a self-contained life raft against the single most hostile environment on the planet. Our objective was clear: descend to the basin floor, navigate to the source of the acoustic signal, and use the Charon's scientific suite to determine its origin. We were to take sediment cores, water samples, and high-definition video. We were prepared for strange geology, perhaps a new type of hydrothermal vent or a unique mineral formation. We were not prepared for what we found. The plunge began like any other. The massive A-frame crane on our support vessel, the Erebus, lifted the Charon IV from her cradle and lowered her into the choppy waters of the Western Pacific. I ran through the final pre-dive checks, my voice a calm monotone over the comms linked to the surface. Ballast tanks flooded. All systems green. Releasing the tether. With a final clank, I was free. The Charon tilted to her vertical descent attitude, and the world of sun and sky vanished, replaced by a deepening blue. The descent is a journey through layers of existence. The first few hundred meters are teeming with life. Then, at around 332 meters, the last vestiges of sunlight are extinguished. You enter the perpetual twilight, and then the true abyss. The temperature gauge on my console began its steady march downward, from the warm surface waters to the near, freezing chill of the deep, eventually stabilizing between 1 and 4 degrees Celsius. The only sounds were the familiar symphony of the submersible, the low, steady hum of the electronics, the soft whir of the life support fans circulating the air in my tiny sphere, and the periodic, high-pitched ping of the acoustic positioning system, our only link to the surface, triangulating my position in the immense darkness. Outside the thick acrylic viewport, the world was a perfect, featureless black, a darkness so absolute it felt solid. It was a void that my brain, starved of stimulus, desperately tried to fill. This was where our training was most critical, the point where the unprepared mind could begin to fray. I switched on the external LED lighting array, a 7-foot panel that cast a brilliant cone of white light into the void, illuminating the blizzard of marine snow, the constant rain of organic detritus from the world above. This was the foundation of the Hadal food chain. As I descended deeper, through 8,000 meters, I began to see the locals. A small, translucent Mariana snailfish, Pseudoloparus swire, fluttered past the viewport, its gelatinous body perfectly adapted to the pressure. It was the deepest, living fish ever discovered, a creature that thrives where others are crushed to pulp. A little later, a deep, sea dragonfish, a nightmarish predator with a disproportionately large jaw and fang, like teeth, drifted into view, flashing its bioluminescent lure in a vain attempt to attract prey into the beam of my lights. Giant, shrimp-like amphipods, some the size of my hand, scattered from the light. Their shiny carapaces a testament to their unique adaptation of using aluminum to reinforce their shells against the pressure. These were the familiar monsters, the known inhabitants of this alien world. Their presence was comforting, a confirmation that despite the extreme conditions, the laws of biology still held sway. They were the baseline of normalcy, a baseline that was about to be erased. At 10, 9, 15 meters, the descent ended. The Charon's thrusters fired gently, arresting my fall just meters above the seafloor. The view outside the port was exactly as the AUV's sonar had predicted, and it was deeply unsettling. I was hovering over a vast, flat plain of what looked like black glass. The super fine sediment, like baby powder, swirled up by my thrusters, did little to obscure the unnatural smoothness of the basin floor. There were no ridges, no cracks, no signs of the chaotic tectonic activity that defined the rest of the Mariana Trench. It was as if a giant hand had smoothed the bottom of the world. Surface, this is Thorn. I am on the bottom. The basin floor is, as per the data, it's flat. Unnaturally so. Beginning preliminary survey. The voice of the mission director, Dr. Evans, crackled in my ear, the signal traveling for nearly 15 seconds through the water column. Copy that, Eris. Proceed with caution. How are the environmental readings? I scanned the console. Pressure, temperature, salinity all nominal for this depth. No signs of unusual chemical signatures. I'm activating the hydrophone array. I flicked a switch, and the external audio feed filled my headset. I expected to hear the familiar sounds of the deep, the distant groans of tectonic plates, the rumble of a far-off submarine earthquake, perhaps the low-frequency calls of a baleen whale echoing for hundreds of miles. Instead, I heard the hum. It was exactly as the AUV had recorded, but with a clarity and power that sent a shiver down my spine. It was a structured, ultra-low-frequency pulse, a deep thrum that I felt in my bones as much as I heard. It repeated with perfect metronomic regularity, a 5-second pulse, followed by 12 seconds of silence. Over and over, my mind, trained for analysis, raced through the possibilities. It wasn't geological. The signature of an earthquake or an icequake, the real source of the famous bloop sound, is chaotic, a rising crescendo followed by a slow decay. This was orderly. It wasn't biological. No known whale call is this rhythmic, this monotonous. And it certainly wasn't anthropogenic. It lacked the distinct blade lines of a ship's propeller, or the sharp, percussive bang of a seismic airgun. It was a signal that, according to everything I knew about the ocean, should not exist. Evans, are you hearing this? I asked, my voice tight. A pause, then his voice returned, strained. We're receiving it, Aris, loud and clear. The power output is immense. The source must be massive. The signal was coming from a precise point, roughly 2 kilometers from my current position, toward the center of the obsidian plain. I'm going to get a closer look, I said, my hands already on the thruster controls. Negative, Aris, hold your position, Evans commanded. That's an unknown energy source. We don't know what it is. Your mission is to observe and collect data, not to make contact. But he was wrong. My mission, my entire life's purpose, was to understand the things that lurked in the deep. This signal was the greatest mystery I had ever encountered. A piece of data that suggested a new category of existence. The tranquility of the abyss was gone, replaced by an electrifying, terrifying curiosity. With respect, Ken, observation from this distance is insufficient, I replied, overriding his command. I'm proceeding to the source. I eased the joystick forward. The Charon IV surged ahead, her lights cutting a path across the impossible plain, chasing the steady, 17-second heartbeat of the thing that was waiting for us in the dark. The 2-kilometer journey felt longer than the 7-mile descent from the surface. The Charon's thrusters propelled me at a steady 3 knots, but in the featureless void, it felt like I was standing still. The obsidian plain stretched before me, a perfect, unblemished sheet of black. My lights, powerful enough to turn night into day 100 feet out, seemed to be swallowed by the surface, casting no meaningful reflection. There was no marine snow here, no detritus from the world above. It was sterile, the familiar, comforting signs of life. The ghostly snailfish, the scavenging amphipods, were gone. It was as if this 10-kilometer circle of the seafloor had been wiped clean of biology. The hum grew in intensity with every meter I traveled. It was no longer just a sound in my headset. It was a physical presence. A low, resonant vibration worked its way through the Charon's syntactic foam beam and into the steel of my pilot sphere. I could feel it in the deck plates beneath my feet, a deep, cellular thrum that seemed to harmonize with my own nervous system. It was hypnotic and deeply unnerving. Aris, what is your status? Your telemetry is breaking up. Evan's voice crackled through the speakers, distorted by static. The 15-second light speed delay felt like an eternity. Proceeding to source. I reported, my own voice sounding tight in the confined space. The signal is causing significant interference with the acoustic link. The vibration is palpable now. Abort Aris! That's a direct order. Return to the deployment coordinates. We don't know what you're flying into. His voice was a garbled mess of digital noise, the words barely intelligible. The hum was actively fighting our attempts to communicate, a wall of sound that was isolating me from the surface, from the rest of the human race. I reached for the comms panel to respond, but a burst of static, sharp as a gunshot, erupted from the speakers, followed by silence. The link was dead. I was alone. The thought didn't bring the usual sense of calm solitude I felt on these dives. This was a different kind of alone. This was the feeling of being watched. My training screamed at me to turn back, to obey the last coherent order I'd received. But the scientist in me, the explorer who had dedicated his life to the unknown, couldn't. This was the greatest unknown of all. After another 20 minutes of silent, tense navigation, my forward-looking sonar finally painted an image on the screen. It was impossible. Directly at the center of the plane, the source of the signal was not a geological formation. It was a structure. As I drew closer, its form resolved in the beams of my lights. It was a perfect ring, a massive, circular aperture standing vertically on the seafloor, easily 300 meters in diameter. It was made of the same non-reflective black material as the plane, a substance that drank the light and gave nothing back. It wasn't built on the plane. It was part of it, rising seamlessly from the glassy floor as if it had been grown there. There were no tool marks, no seams, no sign of construction. Its edges were impossibly sharp, a perfect geometric form in a place where the crushing pressure and chaotic geology should permit no such thing. I brought the Charon to a halt 50 meters from the edge of the ring. The hum was now a deafening, bone-jarring roar. I shut off the external hydrophone feed, but the vibration in the hull was so intense that the air in the sphere itself seemed to buzz. It was like being inside a colossal tuning fork. My God, I whispered to myself, the words lost in the low frequency drone. I began my survey, my hands moving over the controls with practiced efficiency despite the tremor in my fingers. I activated the high-resolution imaging sonar, hoping to get a sense of the structure's internal composition. The sonar pulses went out, and the return screen remained blank. It wasn't just absorbing light, it was absorbing sound too, a perfect acoustic black hole. My mission parameters were clear: observe and collect data. I extended the Charon's hydraulic manipulator arm, its multi-jointed limb unfolding from the side of the submersible. My plan was to scrape the surface, to collect even a microscopic sample of this impossible material. Slowly, cautiously, I guided the titanium claws of the manipulator toward the outer edge of the ring. The arm moved through the water, the only object in this sterile environment, a tiny silver probe reaching out to touch the face of a god. The moment the claws made contact, two things happened simultaneously. First, the hum stopped. The sudden, absolute silence was more shocking than the noise had been. The vibration ceased. The oppressive pressure on my skull vanished. The abrupt quiet was so profound it was painful, a sensory vacuum that left me feeling dizzy and disoriented. My ears rang in the stillness. Second, the structure responded. The inner circumference of the ring, which had been as dark and featureless as the rest of it, began to glow. A soft, blue-white light emerged, not from any specific source, but from the material itself. It pulsed with a slow, biological rhythm, like the phosphorescence of a deep sea creature. The light illuminated the water in front of me, revealing that the aperture was not an empty frame. It was a gateway. Inside the ring, the water was no longer clear. It was shimmering, distorted like a heat haze rising from asphalt. It was a barrier of pure energy. A cascade of alarms suddenly shrieked through my sphere. The main LED array flickered and died, plunging me into near darkness, save for the eerie blue glow from the ring and the red emergency lights of my console. "Power failure on the main bus!" I yelled into the dead comm system, my heart hammering against my ribs. Multiple system shorts. I fought to keep the Charon stable, but the controls were sluggish, unresponsive. The submersible was being pulled forward, caught in an invisible current that was drawing me toward the shimmering gate. The thrusters fired at maximum power, but it was like fighting a river. I was losing. Through my viewport, I watched the blue, white light of the gate grow brighter, filling my world. And then, from the shimmering distortion within the ring, a shadow began to emerge. It wasn't a fish or a squid. It was something else, something whose geometry didn't belong to this world. I caught a glimpse of a limb, a vast, articulated appendage covered in the same light, devouring black material as the ring. It was impossibly large, a single segment of it, dwarfing my entire 24-foot submersible. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied its colossal size. The shadow blotted out the light of the gate. A new sound filled my headset, not the structured hum from before, but a high-frequency, clicking shriek that bypassed the hydrophones and seemed to drill directly into my brain. It was the sound of something ancient and aware. It was the sound of something hunting. The last of my external systems failed. The forward cameras went dark. The sonar screen turned to static. The emergency lights on my console flickered one last time and died. I was blind, deaf, and adrift in the crushing dark, 7 miles below the sun. And the thing from the gate was still coming. Panic is a luxury you cannot afford 7 miles down. As the last of the emergency lights died, plunging my world into absolute blackness, my training took over. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands moved with a steady, practiced calm born of 1,000 simulations. Fire, flood, catastrophic hull breach, loss of life support. I had drilled for every conceivable disaster. But there was no procedure for being hunted by an impossible entity from beyond a dimensional gate. The silence was the most terrifying part. The high-frequency shriek had vanished, leaving a void that was somehow heavier and more menacing than the bone, jarring hum that had preceded it. The only sounds were my own ragged breaths and the frantic thumping of my heart. I was a solitary consciousness adrift in a steel coffin, blind and deaf to the monster that I knew was just outside. My first priority was life support. I fumbled in the dark for the manual override panel, my fingers finding the familiar toggles and switches by touch alone. A flick of a switch, and a low-power battery-backed eddy strip flickered to life, casting a sickly red glow over the console. The air scrubbers were still functioning, their software a comforting reassurance that I wasn't about to suffocate. The oxygen levels were stable. I had 56 hours of air, but that was a meaningless number if I was trapped on the bottom of the ocean. Next was power. The main bus was dead, likely a massive short caused by whatever energy field the gate had projected. The Charon IV had 3 main buses of batteries, a triple, redundant system designed for just this kind of catastrophic failure. If I could isolate the fried circuits, I might be able to reroute power from the backup batteries to essential systems. My hands flew across the main breaker panel, the red emergency light glinting off the sweat on my brow. I physically disconnected the main power bus a shower of sparks erupting from the fried connection. Then, holding my breath, I engaged the first backup bus. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a reluctant groan, a section of the main console flickered to life. Green status lights blinked on one by one. Propulsion, navigation, external lights, all still offline. But the core computer was booting up. I had a brain again. The next 10 minutes were a tense, methodical battle against the submersible's crippled systems. I was an organ transplant surgeon, carefully rerouting the precious flow of power. Bypassing fried circuits and dead components, I managed to restore power to one of the 12 thrusters, not enough to fight a current, but enough to maintain my orientation. I brought the inertial navigation system back online, a small mercy that at least told me I was still in the same spot, hovering 50 meters from the gate. Finally, I tried the external cameras. The main 3D imaging system was dead, its power conduits fused. The manipulator arm camera was also unresponsive, but a single, low-resolution engineering camera, mounted on the underbelly of the submersible, flickered to life. The image that appeared on the small monitor was grainy, distorted by static, but it was enough. The gate was still there, a perfect circle of soft, blue-white light, pulsing with that slow, hypnotic rhythm. The shimmering distortion within it was gone, replaced by the clear, black water of the trench, and the creature, the colossal shadow with its articulated limb, was nowhere to be seen. A wave of relief so profound it left me weak washed over me. It was gone. Whatever it was, it had retreated back into its own dimension. The relief lasted for exactly 12 seconds. A new alarm, a soft, insistent chime, echoed through the sphere. It was the short-range proximity sensor, a system I had just managed to reboot. Something was out there. The screen showed not one contact, but dozens. They were small, no bigger than a person, and they were moving fast. Too fast. They were converging on my position from all directions, emerging from the darkness that ringed the obsidian plain. I slewed the single working camera around, trying to get a visual. For a moment, I saw nothing but the sterile black floor. Then, a shape shot through the camera's limited field of view. It was a dark, spindle-shaped form, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. Another followed, then another. They were a swarm. They reached the Charon in seconds. The first impact was a jarring thud that shuddered through the entire submersible, followed by the high, pitched screech of metal on metal. More impacts followed, a percussive storm against the steel hull. They were attacking. I angled the camera upwards and finally got a clear look at one of them. It was clinging to the syntactic foam of the main beam, its form a nightmarish fusion of biology and geometry. It had a long, segmented body made of the same light, devouring black material as the gate. It had no discernible head, but a cluster of glowing blue photoreceptors pulsed at its forward end. 6 razor-sharp, articulated limbs, like those of an insect, were clamped onto the hull, digging into the foam, tearing away chunks of the material that protected me from the crushing pressure. It moved with a horrifying, unnatural speed, scuttling across the surface of my vessel like a spider. Another one appeared in the camera's view, this one attacking the housing of the dead manipulator arm. It used 2 of its limbs to brace itself, while the other 4 worked with terrifying precision, prying at the seals of the hydraulic joints. I was watching my submersible being dismantled piece by piece. A new sound began, a rhythmic, high-frequency clicking that I could hear through the hull. It was a sound of communication, the swarm coordinating its attack. They weren't mindless beasts. They were intelligent, and they were working together to break open my tiny steel shell. I had to get out. My hands trembled as I brought up the propulsion control screen. The single working thruster was useless against their numbers. My only option was a full emergency ascent. The Charon IV was designed with two massive 550-pound ballast weights held in place by electromagnetic clamps. Releasing them would send me rocketing toward the surface. It was a last resort. Once the weights were gone, I could never submerge again. I would be a cork, bobbing helplessly on the surface. But the surface was 7 miles away. I navigated to the emergency release screen. The system required a 2-step authorization, a safeguard against accidental activation. I entered the first code. The screen flashed, asking for confirmation. A violent jolt threw me against my restraints. A new alarm screamed, a hull pressure warning. One of them had managed to breach an external sensor housing. A tiny, high-pressure jet of water was now blasting against the outer hull. It was only a matter of time before they found a more critical weakness. My finger hovered over the final confirmation button. This was it. I was abandoning the mission, abandoning the greatest discovery in human history. I was running. Another screech of tearing metal, this time directly above me. They were on the pilot sphere itself. I could hear them, their sharp limbs scraping against the 64 millimeters of steel that separated me from oblivion. I slammed my hand down on the button. A deep, resonant sea lag echoed through the hull as the electromagnetic clamps released. The Charon IV lurched upwards with a force that pinned me to my seat. The ascent had begun. The proximity sensor screen showed the swarm clinging to me, a cloud of death being dragged up from the bottom of the world. Their combined weight was slowing me down, reducing my ascent rate. The pressure alarms continued to shriek as they relentlessly tore at the submersible's exterior. Through the grainy feed of the single working camera, I saw the glowing blue ring of the gate shrinking below me, a malevolent eye in the crushing darkness. We had come here seeking knowledge, seeking to understand a strange anomaly. We had found something else entirely. We had found a doorway, and in our arrogance we had knocked. Now something had answered, and it was following me home. The ascent was a 2.5-hour symphony of destruction. Releasing the ballast weights sent the Charon IV rocketing upwards, but the swarm of creatures clung to the hull, their combined mass acting as a drogged chute, slowing my escape. The sounds were horrific. Through the 64 millimeters of steel, I could hear the high-pitched screech of their limbs tearing at the syntactic foam and the sickening, percussive thuds as they hammered at viewports and sensor housings. Pressure alarms, proximity warnings, and hull integrity alerts shrieked in a chaotic chorus. The single red emergency light cast long, dancing shadows in the sphere as the submersible shuddered and bucked. Water began to seep in, not as a jet, but as a fine, cold mist condensing on the bulkheads, a sign that the immense pressure outside was finding microscopic weaknesses in the sphere's welds. The temperature inside plummeted. I was ascending through the water column, but the familiar journey from the near, freezing abyss to the warm surface waters was reversed. The cold of the deep was following me, seeping into my sanctuary. As I passed through 8,000 meters, the nature of the attack changed. The rhythmic scraping and hammering gave way to a series of sharp, explosive pops against the hull. I risked another look at the grainy feed from the engineering camera. The creatures were dying. The rapid decrease in pressure was doing to them what it would do to any deep sea organism dragged from its habitat. Their black, geometric bodies were rupturing, imploding outwards in the relatively low pressure. But their deaths were not a reprieve. Each one that ruptured seemed to release a burst of corrosive energy, leaving a pockmark of scorched, bubbling metal on the hull. They were dying, but they were taking me with them. By 4,000 meters, the last of the swarm was gone, destroyed by the laws of physics they had so clearly defied. But the damage was done. The Charon was a crippled wreck, ascending on buoyancy alone. The single working thruster was dead, its power conduit severed. The pressure alarms were now a constant, steady scream. The mist inside the sphere was thicker, the air heavy with the taste of ozone and salt. My breath plumed in front of me. I was losing the race against the cold. I spent the final hour of the ascent in a state of detached focus, a mental state drilled into me by years of training. I sealed my emergency breathing apparatus over my face, conserving the sphere's dwindling oxygen supply. I manually jettisoned every piece of non-essential external equipment: the dead manipulator arm, the fried lighting array, the useless sample baskets, anything to lighten the load and increase my ascent speed. It was a desperate, frantic shedding of my scientific purpose, leaving a trail of expensive, ruined technology sinking back into the abyss. All that mattered was the surface. When the Charon IV finally breached, it wasn't a triumphant emergence into the light. It was a violent, convulsive burst from the waves. The submersible lolled on the surface like a wounded whale, listing heavily to one side. Sunlight streamed through the viewport, blindingly bright after the absolute darkness. Through the acrylic, I could see the blue sky, a sight I thought I would never see again. The rescue was a blur. The crew of the Airbus had tracked my uncontrolled ascent, a distress signal clearer than any verbal communication. The ship was on me in minutes. I could hear the shouts of the crew, the roar of the Zodiacs being launched. I didn't have the strength to respond to their hails. I used the last of the backup battery power to fire the explosive bolts on the main hatch. With a deafening bang, the hatch blew clear, and blessed, warm, breathable air flooded the sphere. Hands reached in and pulled me out. I collapsed onto the deck of the Zodiac, shivering uncontrollably, my muscles cramping from the cold and tension. As they sped me back toward the Airbus, I looked back at my submersible. It was a nightmare. The sleek, advanced vehicle I had piloted into the deep was a mangled wreck. The syntactic foam beam was gouged and torn, shredded as if by giant claws. The steel pilot sphere, engineered to withstand 16,000 psi, was scarred and pitted with scorch marks. Deep, unnervingly precise geometric patterns were carved into the metal, patterns that no geological process could create. It was the wreckage of an animal attack, an attack by something that should not exist. In the ship's infirmary, wrapped in thermal blankets with warm IV fluids being pumped into my arm, I told my story to Dr. Evans. I recounted everything: the impossible plane, the geometric ring, the silence, the gate, the shadow, and the swarm. He listened intently, his face a mask of professional concern, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. "Aris, you were down there for over 12 hours, he said gently when I finished. Alone, in complete sensory deprivation. The psychological strain is immense. We've seen. It wasn't a hallucination, Ken." I rasped, my voice hoarse. "Look at the Charon. Look at the hull." "We will," he said, his tone placating. "The telemetry data was corrupted before we lost the link. The solid-state recorders in the sphere are fried. All we have is the damage to the sub and your testimony." He didn't have to say the rest. My testimony was that of a man who had just undergone one of the most extreme and isolating experiences a human being can endure. It was the story of a man whose mind, starved of stimulus, could have simply created its own monsters from the deep. The physical evidence was ambiguous. The claw marks and scorches, just anomalous damage that could be attributed to a dozen unknown geological or chemical phenomena. Without the data, my story was just that, a story. I was about to argue, to scream, when the infirmary door opened. It was the lead acoustics officer, a young woman named Jensen. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She ignored Evans and walked straight to my bedside, holding a tablet. "We have to show you this, doctor," she said, her voice trembling. "It started about an hour ago, from the anomaly's coordinates." She turned the tablet so I could see the screen. It was a spectrogram, a visual representation of sound. But it wasn't the simple, metronomic pulse we had first detected. This was a waveform of staggering complexity. It was dense with information, structured, layered, and perfectly, mathematically precise. It was a signal that made our most advanced digital communication schemes look like smoke signals. "It's no longer just a low, frequency hum," Jensen said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's broadcasting across a huge range of frequencies, acoustic VLF even higher. It's the most powerful, most complex signal we have ever recorded from the ocean." I stared at the screen, and a cold dread, far deeper and more profound than any fear I had felt in the abyss, settled into my bones. The frantic escape, the fight for survival, it had all been a distraction from the terrible truth. My actions, my clumsy attempt to touch the structure, had been misinterpreted. Or perhaps they had been interpreted all too well. The hum hadn't been a heartbeat or a beacon. It was a sentinel's lonely watch, a simple, patient ping repeated over millennia, listening to the silent, lifeless world above. It was the sound of a guard post. We had come in our hubris, with our lights and our machines, and we had knocked on a door that was never meant to be opened. We had announced our presence, and now the guard post was reporting in. I looked from the complex signal on the tablet to the viewport of the infirmary, out at the vast, indifferent blue of the Pacific Ocean. The silence from the deep was over. The broadcast had begun. We went down there looking for a new world. Instead, we had just alerted an old one that ours was finally ready for harvest.